Chris is going to be making a presentation shortly. If you have questions for him during the presentation, please put them in chat. After he's done, we will open this up for Q&A. And let me see if there's anything else. Oh, yeah. Our November 21st book club meeting is going to be with Jeff Deutsch. His book, In Praise of Good Bookstores. He's supposed to be back from his European book tour by then. So we're all looking forward to that. And just to let you all know, we're working on our 2023 event schedule, but we haven't got anything planned yet. So we will publish that as soon as we have it ready. So at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Dottie, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Dottie.
Thank you. So again, we're very pleased that Chris Blattman, who's a resident of Hyde Park, is here with us tonight. And Chris is the Romilly E. Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies at the University of Chicago, where he co-leads the Development Economics Center and directs the Obama Foundation Scholars Program. His work on violence, crime, and poverty has been widely covered in the media by the New York Times, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Times and NPR, to name a few outlets. Chris holds a PhD in economics from the University of California at Berkeley and a master's degree in public administration and international development from Harvard University School, Kennedy School of Government. So Chris, many thanks for being here, and I'll turn things over to you.
No, it's terrific to be here, and thanks. I'm now I'm year 7. Year 7 as a Hyde Parker, which still makes me a relative youth. Any other city in the world, and I'd be an old timer, but that's not the case here. Would we look forward to being longtime Hyde Park residents? So I will use just a few slides because I think it sort of helps to illustrate some of the ideas. So I think you should all be able to see the titles. And I do invite you to throw, we're a small intimate group, so I do invite you to throw questions into the chat as we talk. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try to talk about some of the big ideas in the book. And I like to start by saying this, in some sense, this isn't really a book about my ideas. It's a book about this sort of world I've inhabited for most of my professional life, about 20 years, and all the ideas that completely changed how I think about why people fight. And it was a book born of frustration because I felt that there were all these amazing insights from not different social sciences. So I was trained as an economist, and I taught in political science department for many, many years. I do a lot of sociology day to day in my work these days, and I married and write a lot of papers with my psychologist wife. And so each of these disciplines had something to add. And as well as a lot of hard-won lessons from practitioners. And so sort of out of this frustration that a lot of people didn't seem to sort of have access to these ideas, I tried to put them all together and organize them and make them readable. So that's the spirit. And I can't give you a whole book in 20 or 25 minutes, but I like to give sort of 5 big ideas that then structure discussion from where we can talk about just about anything. And then the first idea really in the book, I think I realized writing the book, is actually that most of the time we don't fight. That fighting is just so ruinous that we prefer to loathe one another in peace. And it's really easy to forget. And one reason I think it's easy to forget is we don't write a lot of books and articles about the times when peace doesn't when peace doesn't fail, right? And or we write them and we don't necessarily read them. So for example, about a week or two into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, India accidentally launched a cruise missile at Pakistan, and nothing happened. That day, as just like most, not all, but most of the days for the previous several decades, no war broke out. Now, of course, if it had, right? We could all imagine, we'd all be seeing an article about the India-Pakistan war every day in the newspaper, and people would trace back the roots. But it didn't happen, and so it sort of fades a little bit from attention. And so the state of even people who study conflict, and the state, I think, of the casual observer who's just reading the newspaper and trying to understand conflict, it's a little bit like being an emergency room doctor that's forgotten that most people are healthy. Now, fortunately, our doctors don't make that mistake most of the time. And in fact, the entire medical profession, training, research, treatment are all rooted in the fact that the natural state of humanity is human health, and it would be hard to forget that as a doctor. But I think we actually do forget it when we think about conflict. All we see is the terminally ill patients. And the problem, there's sort of two problems with that. So the first problem is that it's really depressing. So you start to feel like, you hear things like, oh, the natural state of humanity is war, or we're in ever present state of conflict. And that's just not true. You can actually go to the data and you can see that 999 ethnic groups out of 1,000 that are next to one another have adversarial relations, don't fight. 999 days out of 1,000, or 999 cities out of 1,000 in India do not have riots, and 999 national rivalries on the international stage simply remain sort of bitter rivalries and don't turn into violence in a given year. And so we don't want to forget that. But the second mistake, the second thing that's even worse than getting depressed, is that we're going to get the diagnosis and treatment all wrong, right? It's as if we were, if you only focus on the times peace failed and you trace back events, you'll see ancient hatreds, poverty, inequality, climate shocks, all sorts of adverse things happening. And it's easy to think and trace those to the violence. But what actually happens when you take all the times when peace didn't fail, when these adversaries simply loathed one another, in peace, you find a lot of the same things. You find ancient hatreds and poverty and so forth. And so these aren't irrelevant, but they're probably misleading as the cause of war. And so this is a really useful frame. And I want to add one more thing to it, not just that war is rare, but war is rare because it's so ruinous. And this is, technically this is game theory, but actually it's really kind of basic arithmetic. Every time two adversaries, and this could be, this could be two countries, two ethnic groups, two gangs, two political factions in a country. Maybe they're gambling over it. Maybe they're fighting over a territory. Maybe they're contesting a parliament. Maybe they're contesting some other thing they both value. It's like a pie. And in my example here, the two sides are roughly evenly matched. And so they have a choice. They can either share that pie roughly in proportion to their relative power, which is basically their relative ability to burn the house down. Or they can fight over that pie, destroy a share of it, and then flip a coin to see who gets it. And so this is just really a really basic expected value calculation that is sort of is sort of a useful way or useful starting point to think about why most of the time people don't fight, right? Because basically the costs of war open up this wedge that you see here, and that's basically that's like a peace dividend or a peace bonus that everybody gets to split if they find a peace, if they can sort of loathe one another in peace, right? And so it's almost always better to split an undamaged pie than to split a damaged one. And this was true even in the case of Russia and Ukraine, where for 20 years Vladimir Putin literally tried every tactic imaginable short of invasion, right? From political influence to propaganda to support for separatists and even assassinations. And war really was a last resort, right? So that political bargaining, that split, that alternative to war I just mentioned, doesn't have to be pretty, doesn't have to be admirable. It can be hostile and contentious and use underhanded means. But it's always the last It's always the last resort. And it's incidentally one that Russia never needed to resort to with most of its other adversaries in the region. I think someone just needs to mute, actually. Okay, so, all right, so why is this a really useful frame? Well, I didn't write a book called Why We Don't Fight, right? Obviously we fight, and like emergency room doctors, we need to pay attention to those critically ill patients, right? They desperately need that attention. But the reason this is a really useful starting point is not just to make us feel optimistic about ourselves, but because it sort of gives us a really useful lens through which to understand why we do fight. And the fact, and if you remembered nothing else from the entire book or nothing else from this entire presentation, if you had to remember one thing, it would be that every time we fight, it's a reason that our leaders or our society ignored the costs of war or is willing to pay them. And the story of the book is actually that you can take, there's a million reasons for war and a war for every reason. You can take anything you see out there, and at the end of the day, they, generally speaking, they fit into one of 5 main ways we ignore the costs of war. And in the book, I use slightly more technical terms, but for the purposes of today, it's simple enough to think about them as being when our leaders are unaccountable, when our leaders or our societies are ideological, biased, uncertain, or unreliable. Okay, and so let me explain what each of these means, and let me use as an example Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So unaccountable leaders. Well, a leader who's unchecked, particularly an autocrat, right, which is the extreme version, can ignore a lot of the costs of war because they don't pay them. All right, they're only paying attention to the slice of costs that they themselves bear. All right, which is often enough to dissuade them from conflict. An awful lot of autocrats don't go to war. Sometimes being unaccountable can be enough. In particular, when a leader, particularly autocratic leaders, but really any leader, when a leader thinks that it's in their private interest, their ability to preserve their regime, their hold on power, or even to expand the share of the pie they grab in their country, if they think that war will deliver that, then they're likely to take their group to war against the group's interests. Why? Because they're not able to be held to account. And that's obviously a huge factor in Putin's readiness to go to war and his ability to take the country to war. The second is when war delivers something valuable that only war can deliver. Okay, this might just be something that unaccountable leader receives, like personal glory, which is a story we hear about Vladimir Putin, or it can be something that the entire group enjoys, or at least a large portion of that group, perhaps some national ideal. In the case of Russia, you hear a lot of stories in the newspaper about getting the empire back together or accounting for past humiliations. I personally think these are overstated, but you don't have to agree with me or not. You merely have to recognize what kind of explanation. This is saying we went to war in spite of the costs because we get something we want, some intangible, ethereal thing that we wouldn't get otherwise. The other story you hear in the newspaper is a leader who is isolated and insulated from the truth, from a machinery so built, a machinery of sort of propaganda so built to convince ordinary Russians and allies that everything's okay, that everyone starts essentially listening to their own propaganda, or military and an intelligence bureaucracy that's afraid to push bad news up the chain, right? This is a problem that plagues many administrations, even at times the White House, but it's a classic problem of autocracy, where to coup-proof yourself, you've basically insulated yourself from any challenger. And this can be a powerful dissuasion to anyone to sort of give bad news and speak truth to power. And so that's a story of an institutional bias by which you underestimate the costs of fighting or overestimate your chances of victory. You basically get that expected value calculation we just saw all wrong. We can also imagine all sorts of psychological sources of bias as well that aren't just institutional, but maybe born in the leader or their elite group. In the book, I talk about examples such as pervasive overconfidence, which seems to be extremely important in understanding why some groups have gone to war. And secondly, why, and also the ways in which we systematically misperceive our adversaries. But all of these stories of misperceptions, and I actually buy the story of institutional bias that's carried Russia in part to war. But I think it's a bit overstated. And the reason is because I think it ignores the role of uncertainty. So go back to 8 months ago and try to remember just how uncertain so many things were. Russia's military ability, Ukrainian, the quality of Ukrainian resolve and resistance, and the degree of Western unity, especially on something like sanctions. And the idea that Russia would get a bad draw on all three was always within the realm of possibility. But nobody predicted it. No one at all, and least of all Vladimir Putin. And so amidst this sort of fog of war or fog of contest, fighting's always a gamble. Now, no one wants to fight, no one wants to be underestimated. And so there's actually powerful incentives to try to communicate to your enemy, no, this is how strong I am, this is how resolved I am. And in theory, that should eliminate a lot of this uncertainty. But there's something that keeps us from resolving that. And this is where some of the game theory and the strategy comes in. And this is something that anybody understands who's ever played a game of poker, which is that you're worried, everyone would love to be overestimated. Everybody would like to bluff and thereby get a better deal than their military or their other power suggests they deserve. All right, and everybody here knows that in that game, when you don't observe, in that game of poker, when you don't observe your opponent's hand, it's never optimal to bluff none of the time. And it's never optimal to bluff all of the time. You bluff some of the time, knowing that it's going to create a risk of a call or an attack.
Yes, I did it.
I think we just need a couple more people to mute.
God, that was me.
And so just as you know that it's never optimal to bluff none of the time and bluff all the time, in response to that, everybody realizes and gets intuitively that it's never optimal to fold all of the time, fearing a bluff, and it's never optimal to call or attack all of the time. And so it's optimal to call or attack some of the time. And so what this uncertainty does is it not only makes fighting a gamble, but it actually makes it a gamble that's strategically optimal to attack some of the time, even though you think that adversary might not be might be bluffing and they're actually quite weak. Okay, the final situation that can generate conflict and lead us to overlook the cost of war is when we think that whatever deal we could strike, that optimal compromise that keeps them from violence, we don't trust our adversary to keep that deal. And the classic example is when we expect them to be a lot stronger in future. All right, and so we're worried that once they get stronger, they're going to squash us. And then can say, no, don't attack now. Don't lock in your advantage. We promise we'll give you a larger share of the pie than your strength will deserve in future, just to make it worth your while not to attack us now. And often that's successful because there's an international institution or a contract or a legally enforceable deal or some other arrangement, maybe a constitution that allows you to make that kind of credible commitment. But if you can't do that, then you have this incentive to launch an attack now, this preventative war to lock in your advantage. Okay, and of the five, that's probably the one that fits the Russia-Ukraine story the least. You don't need all five to explain every conflict. You might only need one or two. Here, I think four, and for me personally, it's the unaccountability and the uncertainty with a little bit of bias that helps me understand this conflict the best. But I do think this unreliability and this power shift does help us explain the timing a little, in the sense that you can make a strong argument that Russia was at its peak leverage vis-a-vis Ukraine in early 2022, and it was never going to get better. Ukraine was acquiring defensive weaponry, like drones, like these Neptune missiles that we've seen take down ships in the Black Sea. And that was going to make it harder and harder to invade over time. It also seemed to be growing inexorably closer to the West, all right, which might mean more military assistance or might mean more democratic resistance. And so there was a certain now or never logic that didn't so much create this sheer unreliability, but I think helps us understand some of the timing, that Putin left it as late as he could and then invaded before his advantage eroded even further. Okay, the fourth lesson is that these 5 apply to all levels of conflict. And the reason I say that with some confidence is because I don't work at the level of great power war. A lot of the theories and ideas I just gave you came from the study of great power war. Others came from the study of other types of contests, like court battles, right? Most of the time we don't go to court, right? We settle out of court. Why? Because it's inefficient, because going to court is ruinously costly. A lot of it also comes from the study of labor strikes, right? Most of the time management and business, management and labor don't have a labor strike, right? They loathe one another in peace, and only once in a rare moon does that compromise actually break down, and there's a long and extended labor strike. So a lot of the apparatus I've just given to you came from all of these other arenas, and then I applied them and I learned them, and I realized how relevant they were to the types of conflict that I studied. So I spent the first part of my career first working in a civil war, an active war in northern Uganda. And then I spent time studying ongoing ethnic violence and religious violence and street violence in Liberia in the decade after its civil conflict. After that, I went and I studied gang violence and organized crime in Colombia. And today I'm doing a lot of work on street violence in Chicago. And these 5 are extremely relevant for understanding and organizing a little bit what's going on. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the work I've been doing in Chicago, where I've been closely involved in the design and the implementation, and most of all the study of a program called READY. READY Chicago tries to find the 3,000 most violent young men in the city, the one who are most likely to pull a trigger. Many of them do. Half of them are offered this program that involves about 18 months of a transitional job in cognitive behavioral therapy. And so far, we're seeing about 60% reductions in homicide arrests among those who are receiving the program. And I'd be happy to talk more about that later. What I want to talk about is a lot of the young men I've met through this program and why they're shooting on the streets. Engaged in shootings, which as many of you know, are essentially targeted assassinations between individuals or small groups, not gangs. Gangs are, were the larger, more organized hierarchical structures that existed maybe 20 or 30 years ago in the city. Nowadays, they tend to refer to themselves as mobs and cliques and crews because they're smaller, they're a little bit more fragmented and factionalized and leaderless. And you hear 3 main stories of violence. Okay, the first one is about a hot, reactive emotion in response to a perceived slight. That's a reasonably common source of violence, and it's one that our program is directly designed to help people cope with. The second is a story of essentially blood feuds. It's the pursuit of vengeance. It's not a hot-headed emotional reaction. It's a deep satisfaction or a deep desire to see justice done against a rival who may have shot at you or killed your brother or maybe even killed your father or uncle. And some of these blood feuds and rivalries between these mobs and crews can go back years and decades. Those 2 things you hear a lot. The third story, which a lot of people do not hear, but one of these leaders told me about, was he said, look, here's how I became a killer. When we started selling drugs, they robbed us. And we realized that if we were going to continue in this business, they were just going to keep robbing us and we were going to eventually get killed. And so we realized that if we were going to stay in, we were going to have to show them that we were tough and that they couldn't do that to us. And so we had killed them, and we killed them, and we had to kill a lot of people. And occasionally we have to keep doing that in order to establish our reputation. Okay, and so that wasn't a hot-headed emotional response. That wasn't vengeance. That was a cold, cool-headed, calculated, strategic decision about what it took to succeed in this business. Now, what I've just told you is a story of 3 of these 5. I've told you a story of emotional, more interpersonal bias, these emotions, acting rashly, maybe underestimating the enemy and the consequences of your actions. I've told you of a deep sort of ideological drive, something where the act of violence is valuable in itself and they're willing to take those costs and risks to achieve that. But I've also told you a story of uncertainty, because what is reputation? You don't need reputation in a world of certainty. If his strength and resolve had been written on his forehead, no one would have robbed him in the first place. It's precisely because of this uncertainty that he needed to signal and establish a reputation. All right, it's a little bit like in that poker game where when you're choosing whether or not to bluff or choosing whether or not to call, every other poker player you might potentially play with is standing around looking to see how you play. And and if you successfully bluff, they're gonna give you, all of them are gonna give you a better deal, right? And if you seem too afraid to call, all of them are gonna give you a worse deal in the future. And so you have an incentive to signal your strength when that's unknown. All right. Now, when I said these operate at every level, I mean it because I use these exact same three to understand not just the initial US invasion of Iraq, but maybe most of all, why the United States stayed for so long. Yes, there were bias and misperceptions. Scholars like the late Bob Jervis documented well a lot of the intelligence failures and some of the emotional failures that led to some of the decision making. I think that's important. I think it's a little less important than another story of vengeance, one where the United States and many Americans wanted vengeance against Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. And one can imagine a world in which, had bin Laden been killed in the first 2 or 3 years of the conflict rather than almost 15 years later, this ends much more sooner. But I actually think neither one of those is an especially important explanation relative to this quest for reputation, right? So why did the United States want to get bin Laden? And why, when things got extremely tough in their fight against the Taliban, did they refuse to leave? Well, anytime a leader said, if we allow Al-Qaeda to attack and we don't seek retribution, right, then what will insert the blanks think? What will China think? What will Russia think? What will ISIS think? What will every potential terror group or adversary against the United States think? What signal will we send them? What reputation will we have? We'll be inviting attack. Okay, so I think it was a little bit less about the misperceptions and less about the direct vengeance or payoff from seeking retribution than it was about a world of uncertainty, sending signals, not to the Taliban, but to future adversaries about what it would mean to attack the United States. And I think only that helps us understand why this was such a long war. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about before we open it up for questions is that if these are the 5 roots of war, then every path to peace figures out which of those 5 is operating in a particular context, because like I said, it's not all of them, or doesn't have to be, and looks for ways to sort of roll them back. Okay, and in the book, I talk, I walk us through the ways in which economic and social and ideological interdependence accomplishes this. I walk through the ways that the systems, predictable and calculable systems of rules and enforcement, such as a state and a body of law, does this in many ways. I talk about the ways in which political checks and balances are really, really essential to tackling all 5. I also talk about a whole set of interventions, a toolkit that the world has that includes things like peacekeepers and sanctions and so on, and foreign aid in order to tackle the 5, and why all of these are moderately successful. There's no magic bullets, why all of them contribute to peace. Just to give one example, we could talk about mediators, right? What do mediators do? Like, what is it that someone's doing when either at a village level or a neighborhood level or a national level or at an international level, they're trying to mediate between both sides? Well, very often they're trying to counter bias. They're trying to make those leaders at the table behave like more rational beings, right? And countering some of their biases and challenging them, so that they make some of these more sensible expected value calculations that they're supposed to make. They're trying to identify spoilers and splinter groups. These are factions that are unaccountable, that have their own private interests for continuing the fight, and they're trying to help the leaders control them, right? So they're trying to reduce a problem of not so much unaccountable leaders up here, but unaccountable middle managers and leaders who might splinter off and fracture this peace. Most of all, they're trying to resolve uncertainty. They're trying to encourage communication and be a trusted intermediary so that you can believe You find someone who can verify and then can communicate, and you don't have to worry about bluffing. And then to the extent there's an unreliability and problems committing, they're finding clever ways to find commitment. All right. So mediators are tackling a lot of these 5, and the ones who do it well are the ones who are sort of skillful and able to recognize what they need to perform. All right. We don't have a lot of data though. You know, a lot of my work is running things, rigorous experiments like the work we're doing here in Chicago to really see how things work, because a lot of things you think work often don't. We have some cute data. For example, peace is breaking out in civil wars all around the world every week of every year. If your peace breaks out in July or August, if your peace talks and your truce breaks out in July or August, you're about a third or half as more likely to get a mediator. Why? Because all of the parliamentarians and Congress people and whatnot in the United States and Europe are on vacation. And so you're much more likely to get a peace mediator, and you actually then see that those peace truces and those talks tend to be a lot more successful. That's about all the hard data we have at this international level. So it sort of sounds promising, but it's not very hard. It's not a very hard truth. What I've been doing is trying to drive this down to lower levels. I could talk about some of the work we've been running, experiments with mediation at the local level and ethnic conflicts in Liberia. I'd rather tell you and just finish up with some work I've been doing in Medellin more recently. This is Colombia's second city, and it's a site of about 400 incredibly well-organized, hierarchical, organized gangs, not unlike the gang structure of Chicago, maybe 20 or 30 years ago. And it starts with interviewing one of these former leaders in his prison cell, where we've been working with a lot of leaders to try to understand the entire organization of crime in the city. And one of them told us about a fight that broke out over a game of pool, over a game of billiards in his cell block about 10 years ago. He doesn't remember why it broke out, but he does remember that it got out of hand fast. 23 inmates got killed when one side pulled out their guns and fired. And if you want to know why they have guns in Medellin prisons, that'll have to be a whole other book talk. But when the dust cleared, as you can imagine, there was a cycle of retaliatory killings, first in the prison and then out on the streets where the gang's main territory was. And every gang in the city lined up behind one side or the other, and they prepared for war. And Medellin has gone to war at least 2 or 3 times in the last 30 years. And when it has become the most violent place on the planet, more violent than any civil war. But that's not what happened after this billiards incident. There never was a billiards war, because sort of cooler heads prevailed and they decided that nobody makes money in a gunfight. All right, nobody sells drugs. Nobody collects their extortion money when the bullets are flying. But the gangs didn't sort of realize this just on their own, because a group of sort of shadowy mediators, if you will, facilitated this peace. Because instead of having a city of 400 gangs, here we've mapped them all here, you actually have about 17 confederations, right? Each of these sorts of groups of gangs, they're all autonomous, but they sort of have a political confederation with a mafia-like organization called the Razón at its head. And the leaders of these Razones keep the peace within their respective confederation. And to avoid problems between their own gangs and those of a neighboring confederation, they've created something called La Mesa, the table, to bargain. They've created an institution called the office, La Oficina, right? And so if the gangs decide they're going to fight, if they're unaccountable, they have a private interest in fighting, they're ideological, seeking vengeance, they're emotional, or making other misperceptions or biases, well, these guys will provide a set of counter incentives. They'll provide a set of sanctions, sometimes at the point of a gun, to make you think about the cost of war. And if you're uncertain about the other side's strength, and just like regular mediators, they'll provide some shuttle diplomacy, but that's also why they created La Mesa, to structure those dialogues. And if they're having trouble committing to a deal and they think their opponent's unreliable, well, these guys will hold them accountable. And so because of this, Medellin is now one of the most peaceful cities in the Western Hemisphere, with a homicide rate maybe a quarter of what we're experiencing in Chicago and many other big American cities at the moment. Now, this isn't the system of peace that most people in Medellin would like, but it's the one they have. I kind of like to draw the analogy to the world, right? Just like Medellin, instead of 400 fractious combos, we have 200 fractious nations. But we're not all competing in anarchy. Rather, there's a set of confederations with a hegemon at its head, the United States, Europe, Russia, China, that keeps the peace amongst its local gangs or nations. All right, and they too have created a set of imperfect institutions like the UN Security Council instead of La Oficina, and mediators and peacekeepers instead of La Mesa, right? And those institutions that the world has created, they're not equal or just or regularly applied, just as, you know, La Oficina is sort of not equal or just or regularly applied. But to the extent it works, and it does, it's because it creates a measure of peace. Now, we can do a lot better, right? We can do better as a world. And I think we've been incrementally moving towards a better and better set of institutions and interdependence and checks and balances and effective states and systems of, you know, rules and enforcement, right? All the things I talk about in the book, but we're not quite there yet. We're sort of just midway through our journey. And so this makes me somewhat optimistic, but it's not inevitable. And I'll just pause there so that we can move to Q&A rather than keep going. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. I think everything in the book is just so, there are so many ideas, and I just, well, at the beginning of the book, I was kind of depressed. At the end of the book, I was at least thinking that we had some hope, but it is not an easy situation. It is complex. There are a lot of forces at play here. So at this point, I'm going to open this up to Q&A from the audience, and I'm going to see if we can unmute everybody, or everybody, you can unmute yourself. I'm going to switch us over to the gallery view so we can see each other as we're talking.
Hello, I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. So I'm a big fan of ancient history, and one of the most striking facts about ancient history is just how normal warfare is, just how endemic it is, like just how common it is for empires to go to war. Yeah, so like I read some statistics though that like one of the most striking facts of the last 200 years is how much war has declined, and not just in Europe or the Americas, but in every continent, including Africa. So I was wondering if you had any insights about why this was. Why is it that in the ancient world, war was endemic, but in the modern world, war has declined to by like such a big extent?
Mm-hmm. So I think that's true. I mean, I think it's also true even in the ancient world that war is still the exception, not the rule. I mean, when ancient Greek city-states used to fight, and they fought all the time, they usually made sure that those battles and wars never lasted more than one or two battles, or, you know, a few days or weeks. So because war is so ruinous, they strove to keep it short. But I think you're right. I think there has been to some degree a decline, particularly in the last 200 years. Steven Pinker's documented this. But I think you need to sort of think about two different kinds of violence. I think you need to think about interpersonal violence. So I live in a particular state or community. What's the chances I'm killed by a small group or an individual? And that's precipitously declined. Most of all in places with all the things I just described, not just interdependence, but like systems of rules and enforcement, especially the state. Then there's war between these big groups. The wars between political factions that we call civil war, or the wars between nations that we call international war. It's not clear those have declined, statistically speaking. We don't really have enough data, even after 100, 200 years, is part of the story. But the problem is twofold. One is that, well, we still see a lot of civil wars, because I'm not sure we've solved the problems at an international level that we solved at a national level. And maybe the only reason we see fewer international wars is because war is more costly, right? An international war is, they say World War III will be fought with nuclear bombs and World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. What that implies, if war gets more costly, it means it should happen less often, but when it happens, it'll be terrible. And so I think, does that add up to less violence? Well, we'll see. And I hope so. Right. But I do think, I think Pinker's argument is at least half right. It's all this local subnational violence has dramatically fallen.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Kathy, I saw your hand up.
Yes. Two things. Number one, it's my understanding that one of the reasons why Japan wanted to invade territory in its area and also take over the US was they wanted some natural resources that these lands had. So it wasn't an intangible, I mean, that wasn't the only reason, but follow your schema. It wasn't so much an intangible benefit, but a real tangible one. Now, the intangible ones were probably other things, but that was what was driving them, because they didn't have a lot of natural resources of their own, it being a small territory. So that may be sort of was a slight aberration for your idea. But number two, have you just studied what conflict resolution people do? Like, for instance, people who intervene in the tribal conflicts and like Waco debacle that happened in the 20th century.
So to start with Japan, that's interesting. I know more about Germany in World War II than I know about Japan. I guess I would say Japan was militarily powerful. It did want more. Everybody wants more. Everybody always wants resources. The question is, if it was militarily capable enough to wage a war and threaten to win, why didn't it just get those resources more peacefully? Why didn't its adversaries concede? And to some extent, I think one would hardly call its invasion of China and its capture of like Manchuria and Korea as nonviolent, but it at the same time, I also don't. My recollection, I may be wrong here, is that the fighting wasn't necessarily intense or long-standing. It was sort of an imperial takeover, and so the question is, so maybe that's a question of obtaining, but I may be completely wrong because my knowledge of that part of the world is quite limited.
Well, they were emerging as a world power.
Yeah.
And world powers have to have all these resources to do that. And they felt this rivalry with the US in particular.
Yeah.
But also, the other Asian countries. So when they started the war, they had some resources, but they couldn't keep it up without invading.
Well, that's,
they had started in China much earlier.
I guess the argument of the book is most of the time when imperial powers improve their military capabilities, that they're able to grab what they need through a minimum of warfare, because most of the potential adversaries decide it's better to maybe not just acquiesce and not fight, but maybe just to basically get a better deal without having to fight. My limited understanding is Japan was, it's a little bit about the commitment problem. The last thing I talked about, I get into a bit in the book, but I've heard people talk about there being a commitment problem in the sense that they thought that the US was going to enter the war and they needed to try to preemptively attack and essentially gamble. I don't know if that's true. I do think, it was also very clearly a very narrow autocratic regime with unaccountable leaders who weren't paying attention to many of the costs because they didn't have to bear them. And so I think that may play a role, but I've already overextended myself on an aspect of conflict. I don't know that well, so I don't want to.
Well, that's fine. No, you're right. There were multiple reasons, but I was just highlighting that other.
Yeah.
But about I know somebody who's no longer with us, who was lived in Evanston and Chicago, who was the main conflict resolution person for Wounded Knee conflict. And I'm just curious what you think about how these folks work.
So I've studied some conflict resolution folks in West Africa and in Chicago and a little bit in Colombia. And they have different strategies. So I don't want to try to sum up all of theirs. I talked already about mediation. So the kinds of things that mediators do on a global scale, I think, which is reducing bias, reducing misinformation and uncertainty, and helping provide commitment is a really important role at the local level as well. The other thing, one thing that worked very well in West Africa is amidst these ethnic conflicts was actually creating really strong community norms around how conflicts ought to be adjudicated. And so you don't have to help everybody become less biased or less explosive in their outbursts. You don't have to make them trade information, and you don't have to solve their reliability problems. You just have to create some community norms that really discourage certain kinds of behavior. So really classic problem in interpersonal disputes and interhousehold disputes is what they call forum shopping. Is we go to a trusted town leader or someone who resolves and adjudicates that dispute, but the person who doesn't like the outcome then goes to the town chief or the mayor or a court or something else, right? And you just keep going around in circles. That's a kind of commitment problem that's very difficult to solve. And so if you can create norms around not doing that forum shopping, if you can create norms around information sharing, and if you can create norms of appropriate behavior in a dispute setting, even things that are as simple as using your I statements, those can also help reduce misperceptions. So my sense is, like, one way to look at what they're doing is they're trying to solve some of these problems of bias and uncertainty and unreliability. And many of them are successful in this respect, but I'm super interested in this. There's not enough studies of these kinds of programs, and that's kind of an objective for my next 10 years.
Well, thank you very much, because it's important, because it's not just gangs, it's all sorts of groups on the local level that have these kinds of conflicts that need to be resolved.
Well, I have a question.
Sure.
I do mean to put you on the spot. I was going to say I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I do, because I think one of the things that's in all of our minds these days is the situation in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And as I read your book, and as I'm sure other people in this virtual room did, we're wondering how Russia fits into these different 5 categories of aggression or war making, and how the situation falls into the 5 mitigating situations towards the end of the book. And how do you see this playing out?
So I've become more pessimistic over time. I can see several reasons why the fighting drags on many years, which is unusual. I said most of the time war doesn't break out, which is true. When war does break out, it's usually quite short. So the average war over the last 200 years has been about 3 months long. And so we're now, almost 3 times that. So we're off in the tail of lengthy conflicts already, and some of them go on much longer.
Right, and I think it was fairly clear that Putin thought that the war was going to last 10 days.
Right, I think that's part of this, and quite frankly, if we were to sort of rerun this, what happened 50 times, I think there's an awful lot of those times when he might have won in 10 days. I think a world where his fuel convoys don't get attacked and his tanks go into Kyiv, I think the world's very different. I think a world where they successfully captured Zelensky is very different. I think a world where Zelensky got on the plane rather than asking for guns and ammo would be very different. So I'm not sure he was completely wrong. I mean, I think he was wrong. It was reprehensible, but I'm not. I think it was a gamble. I think he got tremendously unlikely. I think we shouldn't always judge the wisdom of a decision by how it was realized in the end due to partly bad luck. At the same time, I do think he was vastly overconfident and misinformed. Okay, but why is he still fighting? If it was all misperceptions, then why keep going, right? So it can't just be misperception. So one is he's still not paying a lot of the costs. I think he's kind of staked his regime. Well, actually, let me step back and say, what do we know are the reasons most wars go on? So one is the story of unaccountable leaders. It sort of says, if a leader, particularly an autocrat, thinks that they will lose power because of a defeat, then they have an incentive to fight on, even if there's a relatively slim chance of war. And I think there's some of that. And it's not, if anything, with the partial mobilization and the what do we call it? Now I'm blanking. Not the acquisition. The formally declaring these parts of Ukraine Russia. He has staked his regime on this. I think the uncertainty of the situation normally resolves pretty quickly. There's a lot of really persistent uncertainty. This is a really great lesson in how slow it takes to sort of resolve a lot of this uncertainty. So, we're still wondering, I think, a little bit about Ukraine's offensive capability. Clearly, it exceeds expectations. Is it strong enough to take Kherson? Is it strong enough to push the Russians back to 20% of what they've got, 40%? We don't know. And the effects of the partial mobilization over the next will take 4 or 5 months to really be told. So there's still a lot of uncertainty that has to be resolved. But I think fundamentally there's a real commitment problem, this unreliability that I talked about. Like, neither side trusts the other to stick to any deal, right? The Ukrainians could come to a deal with the Russians right now that have Russia give back most of what it's taken, and they don't trust Putin not to roll over them again in 2 years after he's regrouped. And Russia can't trust a Ukrainian president to make that deal, because people seem so passionate and inflamed, and this is sort of almost an ideological story. They're so committed to keeping Ukraine whole that it's hard to imagine a Ukrainian electorate that doesn't toss out a president that makes such a deal. So I do think there's a lack of reliability that really has sort of eliminated any room for bargain. And that's very unusual in history, and unfortunately what we're watching unfold.
So isn't that an example of over accountability and not like unaccountability?
It's a good, something, our democracy, so no. So once democracies make a commitment and they enshrine it through, goes through parliament and whatnot, and gets enshrined, democracies have tended to be much more reliable partners. Even though they might have some difficulties. It's not like there's no accountability problems, right? This is, in fact, this is not a problem of democracy. This is the problem of the fact that any democratic leader that made a deal would not be faithfully representing the interests of the Ukrainian people. It's the fact that the Ukrainian people, which is unusual, are basically all of Ukraine or bust. That's driving this, right? Most of the time that doesn't happen, but there are times, there's a lot of parallels between what's going on in Ukraine and this ideological intransigence on we shall have liberty and sovereignty at all costs, and a lot of freedom fighting movements. And I could talk about the Mau Mau in Kenya or the Algerian independence movement, but this is the American Revolution, right? A tyrannical superpower offered the colonists semi-sovereignty because that's basically all their military strength suggested they could afford. They didn't really have formal allies. They probably wouldn't win a war. Pay your fair share of taxes in the empire. Everybody else takes this deal. Why don't you? And they said, no way. They sort of liberty or bust. And many historians of the American Revolution, I think Bernard Bailyn is a good example. The title of his book is called The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. right? It was just to say liberty. It was intrinsically the most important account for this war.
I was wondering, you didn't mention anything in your talk in regard to wars that have had a religious base, whether it was the expansion of Islam in the 7th to the 8th centuries, or if you take the example of the Islamic State recently that's been sort of defeated but still exists in surreptitious ways and has gotten some power back, and where there's uncertainty governmentally in certain areas and provinces. Because I'm not sure how your formulations work with people who are so, you might say, irrational, in the sense that they believe that their way is the only way and everybody else in the world is wrong.
Yeah.
Their practices, and therefore they can't maybe evaluate the wins and losses in a sense, and how to approach it that way, help them in some ways, even though they don't get everything they want.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think there are many varieties. I talked about that ideological bucket. It's something that you get. It's something that you're unwilling to compromise on, essentially. And so I gave examples of national glory. I gave examples of vengeance. You could put a whole bunch of religious motives and ideology in that bucket. You could put this American intransigence over liberty and Ukrainian intransigence over liberty. It's an unwillingness to go halfway on certain things. And so that would be the easy way, and a partially correct way, in my opinion, to sort of think about ISIS, is that we're not willing to compromise, they say, on Sharia law or on certain ways to order society. And so therefore we will fight for it. I think that's partly true. I think the trouble with that is it sort of forgets all the times we don't fight. And actually most ideological groups, most fundamentalist groups, be they Islamist or Christian or whatever, don't fight. They actually do compromise. So what separates the fundamentalist Islamist groups that do and do not use violence? I think part of it might be the unaccountability. I think a lot of these groups have no accountability to their people, essentially, and so they're run essentially autocratically. And so I agree that. So I think, why can that ideological intransigence drive them into war? Well, I think it's primarily because they're so unaccountable and they don't face the main costs of war. And they may even have private incentives for war. But I'm actually not a specialist in Islamist conflict, and so that's my speculation more than me telling you that's exactly how it works.
Okay, thank you.
Well, could I say something here? I just think that I remember in the book you're talking about the English soccer crews, I think you call them, who were in it for the joy of the fight.
Yeah.
Don't you think that has something to do with the Islamists?
Well, partly I told that story precisely to sort of argue in some sense that we have that capacity as humans, but actually it's quite rare. And so we can find episodes, in particular, if you're a military commander or a leader and you want to go to war for your own personal interest or strategic reasons, it is possible to create a certain amount of elation and violence for that purpose. And so you may use that to recruit and fight. That's a tool to strengthen you versus your adversary. Is that the reason you, as a leader, over years and years, sort of decided to actually make your rivalry with another opponent violent and to actually use war instead of politics? I think the answer is mostly no, actually. And that's largely because I think a lot of this aggression and these aggressive impulses are really good at understanding individual behavior and interpersonal violence, and they don't actually seem to describe the violence between even small or medium groups, let alone large groups. So maybe what we have to be careful, it's actually, one of the kinds of biases I talk about in the book as being so problematic is we do have this innate tendency to misread our enemy and demonize enemies. And this actually makes us bad at strategic calculus. So there is this temptation to think of certain people as like inherently violent, as inherently ideological, as we can't possibly compromise with them. And that actually itself is maybe a really problematic bias. Most of the time, these seemingly emotional and ideological groups are quite calculating, and their leaders are quite canny. They might have convinced their people to be sort of a little bit lunatic, but I think the politics of it, they're quite sophisticated, and they're exploiting people in that respect. And that's just as true of the Islamists as of the Rwandans or the Germans, and even Americans once in a while.
So what do you think about the cultures where fighting is part of what it takes to be a man? It's part of the culture. So for example, I have an African friend from the Kikuyu tribe. And he says that in his traditional culture, like when a boy gets to be a certain age range, his profession is to go on cattle raids, like steal cattle from the neighbors. And
He's Kikuyu? And he says that?
He might. Yes, he might have been talking about the
I'm surprised he's Kikuyu. I mean, the Kikuyu are like the people who have been running Nairobi and have been like the bureaucrats and administrators for 200 years. So
he might have been talking about the Maasai too. He has Maasai ancestry.
I mean, so okay. I think there are, so we know for certain that there are many tribal cultures, be that in the European past or in the African, even the African present, where small groups engage in something akin to warfare, like cattle raiding or village raids. The anthropological evidence on this, which is always not that great, right? Especially the stuff from the past, suggests that a lot of that is kind of ritualistic and it's not that violent, all right? So the idea that like two villages in ancient times would be in a sustained warfare over years, this just never happens. Right? It's sort of like one villager, the young man attacks the village and there's a single death and then there's one retaliatory death and then it's over. And so that's war to some extent, but I think it's contained, all right? And then in terms of, do we aggregate this up to higher level violence among nations, and do some nations have martial cultures? I think it's possible, and this shapes interpersonal violence. I'm not actually sure how much that shapes violence between nations, only because war between nations is so long and costly that usually, despite that martial culture, there's still a lot of incentives to find another way. It's rather, what you can think of it is, remember I said, like, you get the share of the pie that your bargaining power says you deserve, where your bargaining power is your military power. Well, what that means is everybody has an incentive to create the martial culture, build the weapons, have lots of soldiers, really arm yourselves to the teeth so that you never have to use those weapons. And ideally, you get a higher share of the pie, or larger share of the pie. And so that's like the tragedy of peace, is that you have to make all of these otherwise societally unproductive investments in warfare that you never use merely to have bargained with your opponent, even in your peace scenario. Yes, Becky.
Mute myself. So this brings up something in my mind that I have heard so many times over the years, that there's no weapon that's been invented that doesn't get used. And that the constant buildup of weapons will inevitably lead to their use in a war. You seem to be saying not so.
Well, I don't know. Inevitable is a strong word. Look, if I guess I said like whatever 99 times out of 100 we don't fight, or maybe 999 times out of 100. Well, I mean, you multiply that 1% or 0.1% probability by enough years, and yes, eventually it gets used, right? That's I didn't write a book called Why We Don't Fight, because we do. Just like I don't say nobody doesn't get ill. I just say we have to remember that most of the time we're healthy, and that's our base case. So the sense in which your statement is true is that, unfortunately, these 5 factors break down often enough that, and the probabilities are high enough that eventually it does come about. Yes.
There, Northern Ireland, Lebanon, the Armenians and the Kurds, these are all long-term situations, centuries in some cases. How can these principles be applied there?
It's a good question. Well, I would say, let me use another example, like Israel-Palestine, which I think the numbers in Northern Ireland, which is another case I know reasonably well, would stand up. Is if you look, I mean, this is a dispute that's been going on for at least 100 years, and it's been violent, intensely violent, about 15 of those years. If we look at the Northern Irish case and we stretch back 800 years, I would venture, it wouldn't surprise me if there was actually significant levels of violence in maybe 5 or 10% of those years. So that's a lot, and that's too much, right? Like I said, I didn't write a book called Why We Don't Fight. We do fight. So, but it helps to remember that a lot of the time, those relationships are somewhat peaceful. And then we have to sort of ask is not why are they fighting in Northern Ireland, but why are they fighting in Northern Ireland only 5 or 10% of the time, and what's different about the times when they fight from when they don't fight? And same about Israel-Palestine. In Israel-Palestine, I think there's a scholar at Northwestern named Wendy Perlman who's a really makes a very persuasive case that the peace breaks down only when splinter factions and spoilers on either the Palestinian or the Israeli side, which is a kind of an unaccountable or unchecked leader, when they defect from the overall leader and basically spur violence. So that explains a lot. And even then, the violence is relatively brief. And in the book, and so that's one explanation. There's others. When it comes to something in Northern Ireland, those episodes of violence, at least the most recent episodes, the Troubles, I argue in the book, had a lot to do with really systemic institutional misperceptions by the British Army on how to handle this conflict. And we could get into that and what some of those are, but I think that anyways, so I think it's different in each case, but I think the important thing to take away is actually many of these places are peaceful most of the time. They're not happy. People aren't necessarily, it's not harmonious, and it's peace in the sense of they're not killing one another. And that seems to be easier to maintain than we give them credit for.
All right, do we have any other questions for Chris? Well, Chris, I would like to thank you for coming. The book was revelatory to me, and as you said, most of the time we don't fight. And based upon what you see in the news, we're fighting all the time. So it's at least reassuring to know that history shows we mostly don't fight, and I suppose that's true because we wouldn't be here if we did. So anyway, thank you for being here, Chris. Yes, Dottie?
I just want to say, Chris, you're doing a wealth of events and talks. So you've got to be very busy.
No, I enjoy it. It's fun to get the ideas out there.
Yes. Yeah, but I saw on your website the number of...
Great. Well, thank you for having me. I hope I'll meet more of you in person in the neighborhood. Please do say hello if you see me.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes.
you very much.
Thanks so much,
Good night.
Chris.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
Night.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Kathy.